Let's go.
Let's go.
Oh, did you want to?
Sorry, I'll let you.
Next time.
I'm in love with you.
Snap out of it.
I'll have what she's having.
Too many guys think they're a concept, or I complete them, or I'm gonna make them alive. But I'm just a fucked up girl who's looking for my own peace of mind. Don't assign me yours.
Caustic wit is my religion.
I would make a great queen because I am so stubborn.
I say when it comes to stardom and Lauren, there are no accidents.
Hi, Karen Peterson.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Citizen Dame, the podcast where we're still in quarantine like everybody else, so we are just going to talk about fun things to do with film history and how women are repressed and all of that kind of thing. I am, as always, Lauren Humphreys-Brooks, and with me is Karen Peterson. Hello, Karen.
Hello.
How are you this fine whatever day we're in now? I have no idea anymore. There is no such thing as time.
Time is a construct, and it means
true.
Nothing.
True. I mean, really, it's definitely... Einstein felt that... It is a construct. There is no...
Welcome to the Relativity Podcast.
So, how are you doing? We were off last week, so what have you been up to the past week or so?
What have I been up to? Watching more stuff, of course. Catching up on TV still. And watching some movies. And I got to see my mom on Mother's Day last week. It was really good. It had been about a month since I saw her because I went over there the week before Easter. And, but this time my brother and sister-in-law and nephew came too. My nephew's 14. And so we all got together and had lunch, and we stayed. She has this nice porch that's big and has like benches on it and stuff. And so we were able to stay safely away from each other while getting to spend just the afternoon together. And it was so nice to just be with my family and laugh and talk. And it's just different when you're trying to do that on Skype or whatever, you know. So, yeah, it was good to see my fam. How about you?
I've been working. I've actually had a lot of work recently, which is good. I'm not complaining. I'm complaining, but I'm not complaining. Like, this is a good thing. And then also just watching movies, making a lot of various forms of bread and baked goods because it gives us something to do. If anyone follows...
Your house looks like the place to be for quarantine, I swear. Between the bread and the alcohol and...
Yeah, so I was telling Karen before we started recording that I somehow managed to buy a lot of alcohol within a very small space of time, which provoked a little bit of concern from my roommate who does not drink, but I was like, look, I'm not drinking all of it at once. I just have a variety to choose from. So that's the principle at work here. But yes, so that's
you
been
gotta
fun.
have options. Exactly.
And also it's summer, so, it's time to switch out some of the dark liquors for some of the lighter liquors. So I needed tequila, you gotta like keep stuff revolving. My parents said that I've gone full Brooklyn, but I'm not entirely certain what that means. I don't know. I bought tequila and limoncello, so apparently that's full Brooklyn. But then also watching movies and yelling at men on the internet like I always do. So that's been fun. So this week we decided that, the past couple of weeks we've been talking about film theory, we talked about film criticism, we talked about feminist criticism. And so we wanted to sort of go back a little bit and actually talk about some of the history of cinema, and particularly right now the beginnings of cinema. Where does cinema kind of come from originally, and how did it develop, and sort of the important early movements of cinema and some of the important early filmmakers. And so we have a lot of different things to discuss. This is partially influenced, I think, by the fact that, first of all, it is National Classic Cinema Day, apparently, which I was not aware of.
Oh, look at that. Look at us.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just like, oh, this is nice. So as we are recording, this is National Classic Cinema Day, and of course, there's always been this long conversation about what are classics. I would say classics are pretty much anything before 1968, but there's some disagreements to that. Back in film school, one of my professors defined it, actually talked about classical cinema, and not really referring to films as classics, but referring to them as classical cinema. And what he meant by that was films made during, within specifically Hollywood films, but films made during the classical period in Hollywood, which would encompass code films, pre-code films, and films made within the studio system. So that would run up to about the early 60s. With kind of the disintegration and eventual collapse of the studio system.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, for myself, because when I talk, oh, that movie's classic, like, to me, it's something that's kind of, this is actually what led us into deciding to talk about this stuff today, was, for me, that's stuff that leads into, like, this is the essentials. These are the movies that I feel like are movies that people need to see. And for me, some of those are even in the 80s. So I think if you break it down by the classical period, that actually makes a lot of sense, because that's a completely different way of looking at different types of films.
Yeah, it's a more precise historical designation, I guess, so that there stops being this, there's so much debate about, is this a classic, is it not? Is it a classic just because it was made in 1938? Even though it's not a very well-known film, or it's even a bad film, right? Or, so Casablanca is a classic, but, some of the Gene Autry movies, which are not particularly high quality, etc., might not, you would still, would you call them classics, right? So that's where the debate gets going. So saying classical is more like a historical designation and is a little bit more precise, but that doesn't seem to be a thing that we do in the more popular mindset.
No. There's a lot of things we don't do in the popular public mindset.
Yeah, I know that people like kind of reject some of the academic designations, and I understand why. And there are issues, and one of the things we're going to talk about today is actually the issues with canon and the issues with some of the way that academe has designated the importance of certain films versus the unimportance of other films. But sometimes academe also gets it right, and it is actually better if we at least are aware of these terms and are able to kind of apply them and to talk about film in a more nuanced, also less judgmental way. Is this classic? Is it not classic? It's like, well, what I define as classic might be different from what you define as classic, but if we're talking about classical, then we're talking about a particular period of film. So, in reference to this, in reference to talking about classical cinema and talking about the essentials, we want to give kind of a quick rundown of the history of cinema and the history of early cinema and where cinema sort of developed from. Now, of course, the second thing you begin, like, well, where did cinema begin? Well, we don't know. Late part of the 19th century. So late 19th century is where you actually begin to get, quote, moving pictures. Now you can go back even farther than that and talk about, shadow plays. You talk about the projection of images with magic lanterns, which became popular in the late 19th century. But really, when you begin to get moving photographic images is around the time of the production of the Lumiere brothers short films around 1895. So you're talking very late 19th century. And of course, you have what very quickly happens in the history of early cinema is you get a breakdown. So you've got the Lumiere brothers who are essentially recording activities, right, with a static camera, and part of this was because of the limitations of the technology of the period. You did not have really recording apparatus or anything like that to record sound, although we'll probably talk about this a little bit later. Sound, there was a use of sound fairly early in silent cinema. Very few silent films are actually 100% silent. And there were different ways that people used sound and different ways to produce sound. Just like most black and white films were not necessarily completely black and white. Mm-hmm. And even when we talk about black and white, what are we actually talking about? There were a lot of tinting. There was a lot of there were a lot of use of filters, things like that. So very rarely, you know, I would always caution people to, when people begin talking about black and white films or silent films, to always to actually look into the reality of those films, because there was a lot of experimentation going on. There's a lot of sort of attempts to do different things with film and to see what film could do. And that's part of the contrast between the things that the Lumiere brothers produced and then some of the films that Georges Méliès produced and other filmmakers, in that the Lumiere brothers were primarily documentary, realistic cinema. That's how we would refer to them. So they were recordings of things like a train arriving at the station, a child taking its first steps, people walking in a park, things like that. So this is this almost photographic preservation of very short snippets of life. And some of it was just about experimentation about, okay, we can actually show this now. We can show, rather than just a photograph of a child, we can show a child walking, and that's pretty spectacular. We can show a train arriving versus just a photograph of a train. And that's surprising when you think about it in that time period where people are not particularly used to seeing this. Suddenly you're able to see these moving images. And but what very quickly happened with the Lumiere brothers and then with Georges Méliès. Georges Méliès was a onstage magician for a very long time, and when he initially saw the demonstrations of the cinematograph that the Lumiere brothers had been using, he pretty immediately saw the opportunity for the way that film could actually be used. So he began producing films that were trick films, trick photography. And I mean, most of us have seen the images from A Trip to the Moon. Mm-hmm. And where you actually have a rocket ship being launched into the moon, and the moon is this person's face, and it's very creepy, actually. But
I love that movie.
It's actually a wonderful film, and I think that one of the things, the Lumiere brothers films are sort of interesting to look at because they're very important in the context of film history. But Méliès films really are brilliant films, and they're very short, but it's amazing what he was able to do with very primitive cinematic technology. The use of overlapping frames and overlapping plates, the use of people basically transforming into other characters. The fact that he took a Jules Verne story and turned it into a film. So this is very often been referred to as the first science fiction film. But so Méliès was kind of playing with what cinema could do beyond simply documenting and showing this is how, this is what life looks like. Because of course, this isn't what life looks like. It wasn't in living color, right? In the sense that there was sometimes color utilized within films, but none of the Lumiere brothers films showed actual people with actual skin tones, etc. It was in very kind of primitive black and white or filtered images, and so Méliès kind of saw the direction that film could go. And in a certain sense, there's always been that kind of conflict within film, the Lumiere-Méliès conflict of, is film meant to be sort of a documentary apparatus, a way of showing reality or coming close to showing reality? Or is it trying to tell a story, trying to tell an unrealistic story, a story that could never actually happen? People can't really be beheaded and survive, but you see it on screen, and is that reality? This is no longer photography as a documentation of real people, but a documentation of what people are capable of in art. And so you've always got that conflict, and I think that conflict really runs through all the way through to today about what we believe and what we don't believe, what film is able to show us and what film isn't able to show us, and where we kind of draw the line.
It's funny, last night, and we'll talk more about this later, but I was watching a documentary about Alice Guy-Blaché called Be Natural. And we'll talk more specifically about her, but she worked with the Lumieres, and that's kind of where she got her start and where film got its start. But there's a section of the documentary where they're talking about these old films and these I mean, I remember seeing The Horse and some other things like in 6th grade, you know?
Yeah.
And the train arriving at the station and some of those. But they're doing this side-by-side comparison, and they're showing these very early films that are just capturing, like you're talking about, just like snapshots of life, basically, but in moving images. And they were doing that side-by-side with YouTube videos. And it was talking about how basically YouTube and people just having access to whatever camera is available to them and being able to just put it out on YouTube is very reminiscent of the very earliest days of film, because people are just trying everything and just seeing what they can do and experimenting, and they don't even realize that they're doing the exact same things that people were doing 150 years ago. And it's really funny, and it was just like watching that was just, wow, people don't change.
They don't. No, it's true. It's true. And yeah, it's a really good point to, like, a lot of the TikTok videos, or back in the day, Vines, YouTube videos, all of those are very reminiscent of those kind of short snippet films that we have from the really early stages of cinema. And some of it is just experimentation. It's playing with it, seeing what can you do? What can you accomplish using comparatively primitive technology and definitely limited technology?
Absolutely, yeah.
In order to create, you know, something that's funny, something that's interesting. You know, there's also a lot of talk about the way that, you know, just regular people use film. So we do things like, you know, we'll pick up our phone and we'll record the skyline because it's really pretty at night, or we'll like record one of our friends saying something because it's funny. We'll record, you know, obviously our children taking their first steps, playing with our pets, all of those sorts of things.
Being at a concert and like watching the crowd jump up and down. That was actually one of the ones they showed, was music and the crowd response. And it was like a YouTube video of a concert, and then next to this film that probably Alice Guy had made, that was just people at a dance hall listening to music and jumping around.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, those. So I think that's a really good point, that we're essentially making the same kinds of films, and that's basically what these early kind of innovators were doing. They were trying to see what they could do, and they were trying to see what cinema was capable of. And then as the technology changed and as it improved, and as people kept on playing with it and seeing like, well, if I can, you know, there are many early examples of animation. How can we move drawn images or shadow images and things like that? And how can we record that and have really, again, so, you know, going back to Melies, these impossible images, right? So dinosaurs, line drawings of dinosaurs walking. Well, you know, obviously dinosaurs don't exist anymore, so the only way that we're able to kind of create some of those ideas visually is via these little moving images. So it's very, I think it's really useful to go back actually and to watch some of these very short films. One of the things that begins to develop is this kind of, again, this argument between the documentary cinema and the cinema of spectacle. And cinema of spectacle is sort of like what Melies was doing, which was essentially recording magic tricks for a while. And then as things changed, he began trying to make different kinds of films. He made things like Trip to the Moon, where it was beyond just, you know, performing a magic trick in front of a camera, and actually playing with the camera more and playing with costuming and what can I represent that is fantastical. But there were also a lot of early cinema also comprised things like showing short snippets of circus performances. There is a very bizarre video that I linked to yesterday on Twitter, because there was a question about a GIF that I used in asking for questions, and it was this very bizarre image of this woman and like a gigantic pig person in a pig outfit dancing, and it's literally a videotaping of a vaudeville, or not a videotaping, a filming of a vaudeville act called The Dancing Pig, and it's weird. It's very weird, but that was the kind of thing that people were recording and that people were producing, because it was all, cinema was a way of getting those stage shows and those stage images to a wider population. And to just sort of impress people and make people go, ooh, ah, and give them a source of entertainment. So that's, I think, where that Lumiere-Melies conflict comes in that we still see today of what is documentary, and just sort of a basic recording, and what is fantastic, what is spectacular. So what's realistic, what's unrealistic, and how do we define those two terms? Because obviously all of this is still about what the filmmaker is choosing to record and is choosing to show, and where they're choosing to place the camera. So, all right, so we've got the conflict between Lumiere and the Lumiere brothers and Méliès, and then of course you get people like Thomas Edison who are coming in and beginning to produce small films, and there's some argument about what Edison actually invented versus what he patented, and I'm not going to get into that entire conversation, because frankly, I just don't care. Edison was very influential and very important in the development of cinema, and particularly in the development of American cinema, but he is not as innovative himself as I think he would have liked to think, or as history is kind of recorded, mostly because he just patented things. But
yeah, Oh, sorry.
No, go on.
Oh, I was just gonna say on Edison, yeah, he was very good at hiring smart people, and then claiming their work. Yes, yeah. Pretty much. But so one of the earliest sort of Western films, and one of the earliest examples of what we have come to know as narrative cinema, is, of course, The Great Train Robbery from 1903. It is a short Western that actually makes use of things like on-location filming and camera movement and camera angles, and of course the very famous shot that has been referenced numerous times, which actually has almost nothing to do with the film. Like, it isn't actually a part of the film itself. It's just sort of the end tag to it, of the man in Western garb turning to the camera and firing directly into the camera, firing a gun directly into the camera, which is famous. I mean, and this has been used, Scorsese has used it. This has been shown across the board. So this is an incredibly influential film, and it was directed by Edwin S. Porter, and of course you can watch it on YouTube, you can watch it on many different places. But it's one of the most famous film, and I always hesitate to say it's one of the first because there's usually something that came before it. But it's one of the earliest films that uses things like composite editing and camera movement, cross-cutting, to create this impression of continuity and continuity narrative and tension. Which is eventually developed over the course of a number of films into what we now really understand as narrative cinema. And you can see the beginnings of that in The Great Train Robbery. This is also a fictionalized narrative, so you're talking about fiction film, you're talking about fictional narrative film that isn't just telling the story of a train arriving at the station. And it's also based on a play, so it's an early adaptation of another art form into cinema. So then you begin to get into these issues of things like the early vaudeville acts that are just being sort of recorded and then reproduced. And then you get into something like The Great Train Robbery, which is much closer to being an adaptation of a film, or of an original play. So you begin to get into these adaptation issues, and that's when film begins to, I think, draw closer to things like literature and theater, in that it is
it's using previous forms of art to tell a different story in a way that only cinema can. Obviously, in a play or in a theater, in a book, you can't take people to an actual train. You have to find a way to reproduce it on the stage. Great Train Robbery is actually taking you to the location and showing you something that really only cinema is capable of. And so it's kind of an interesting turning point in movie making when you begin to get into location shooting and this kind of development of cinema very, very early as its own independent art form that isn't simply recording what can be seen, but actually trying to show something new. Did you have any thoughts about that, Karen?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense that as soon as you figure out that you have this new way of telling stories, that you would tell stories. I mean, as human beings, we've been making up stories since the beginning of our time. And fiction has just always been part of culture, every culture. And it's the way that we pass down lessons and morals and values and things. And so it makes sense to me that once they figured out how to put that onto film and project it on a screen, that it would follow very soon after, that would be another way to start telling a new way to start telling those stories. And it's funny. It was another thing. I'm going to reference this documentary a lot, but another thing I cracked up at watching the Alice Guy documentary last night was when in the very, very earliest days, and they of course they didn't have, and they weren't enforcing copyright laws and as we know them now. And so it was just really funny because they would have this problem where people were just outright stealing from each other all over town. And so you'd have some actors that would do something for Alice, and then they'd run across the street the next day and be like, hey, so we just did this movie and this is how it went. And so then this other group would make the exact same movie. And that was just happening all over the place. And no one was immune to it. But it's funny because that's just human nature, I think. To just copy and steal everything from each other and try to get credit for it. But yeah, I mean, those earliest days of film, really, the industry looks today the way it does, in part because of what was happening as it was being developed.
Yeah, and so then you begin to get into, one of the issues of credit of most films, like really, and we're talking about very early cinema, most films did not have director credits or actor credits or cast credits or anything like that. We're very used to seeing these cast lists, and, here's who directed it, here's who filmed it, here's who wrote it, all of those things. These films were pretty much just produced under, like the Edison Company or Alice Guy-Blache's company. In 1912, formed Solex Studios. Right, and she's kind of credited as being supposedly one of the, from 1906 to 1912, as supposedly being one of the only female filmmakers in the world. I think that that's probably false, but, we kind of, we sort of go with that. She's definitely the best known of the female filmmakers, and she tends to kind of be ignored in favor of people like Edwin S. Porter, in favor of people like later on D.W. Griffith and Cecil B. DeMille, etc., all of those guys. But she was an incredibly important figure in early cinema, and has very recently, as you've been talking about, Karen, has very recently begun to get her due.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I mean, everyone gives Great Train Robbery the designation of being like the first feature narrative. But really, watching this documentary, most people now, they think it was Alice Guy in 1899 with La Fée aux Choux, which is The Cabbage Fairy, which, interesting enough, was a remake of a very short snippet film from a couple years earlier. So basically the first feature film was a remake. Go figure. Yeah. But it was interesting because they actually, for this documentary, which is called Be Natural, The Untold Story of Alice Guy-Blaché, I had to rent it. It's not available to stream for free anywhere, but it was like $3 on Vudu. Totally worth it. But it was interesting because they actually interviewed tons of people from the industry. They talked to directors like, oh gosh, I'm trying to think right now who all was in it. Ava DuVernay. Oh my gosh, I should just look at a list because it was a ton of people. Pete Bogdanovich, just like so many people. And one of the very first questions they ask everybody is, what do you know about Alice Guy-Blaché? And every one of them is just like, I'd never heard of her. No idea who that was. Gail Ann Hurd, who's a producer and writer, she's best known for The Walking Dead. She was like, oh yeah, I've heard of her. And then other people are like, yeah, no, never. And so Gail starts talking about like a little bit of how she was familiar with her work, but even that wasn't that long ago. And like Bogdanovich is all, yeah, I've read so many books about Hollywood. I've written so many books about Hollywood. I have never come across her name. And it just was infuriating. This is where I just started to get so mad. But all these guys were mad too, because they're just like, it's ridiculous that someone was that influential in the foundation of film, and she's been completely erased from history and her spot has been taken away. And it's just in the last few years that we've really started to talk about her and started to talk about her work. And this documentary is actually great because it even gets into some of why it was so hard to know anything about her. But they were able to uncover these interviews that she did in 1964, which is just a couple years before she died. And it was her just talking about the industry that she helped create and her place in it, and even a little bit of how she felt about being pushed aside. And it was just really cool to hear her talking about why women need to have a place in film and why women are so fundamentally important to film. And yeah, it's fascinating. If you have not seen it, I highly recommend watching it. I learned a lot of things.
Well, and thankfully, we do have to say that a lot of her films are now fairly widely available in very good prints, because Kino has been doing the Pioneers Women Filmmakers collections, and so now you can actually watch a lot of her early work, and you see the influence. You see how influential she was on other male filmmakers of the period, many of whom we know better, right? But one of the interesting things is that in terms of talking about, who she was and how important she was, this was not a name that came up. I did 2 years of graduate film work. She wasn't a name that came up in talking about the early days of cinema. We talked about D.W. Griffith. We talked about Thomas Edison. We talked about Edwin S. Porter. We talked about Cecil B. DeMille. We talked about all of those kind of early Hollywood filmmakers and early international filmmakers as well, European filmmakers, etc. We didn't talk about Alice Guy-Blaché. Another person that we didn't talk about, and she in some ways is a little bit closer to being a contemporary of people like Griffith, is Lois Weber. Yeah. Who, and one of my friend Anina very loves saying this, but in 1916, she was the highest paid director. Period. Highest paid director in Hollywood.
Yeah, well, and we'll get to Frances Marion in a minute, but she was the highest paid writer.
Yeah, and so, but in terms of Lois Weber, and Blaché sort of before her, these were incredibly influential women. These were women that were producing films that were popular films, right? So you don't get to the top of your game at Universal by producing films that no one watches. People were watching these films. People were going to see these movies, and specifically, they were getting their names on the credits at this point, right? This was something that they were important figures, and yet nobody talked about them. And you know, we definitely know who D.W. Griffith is. You know, when you say Lois Weber, like, well, who the hell is Lois Weber? You know, a couple years ago, I didn't know who Lois Weber was. So I think that it's very good that now we actually are having this conversation, but it's also very sad because you're talking about these people that did influence Hollywood and did influence the development of cinema across the board, and attempted new techniques and told different kinds of stories and told some very interesting stories. And yet, we don't know their names. They're not being given credit. They're not being given historical credit. And we're still talking about these comparatively terrible people. I mean, D.W. Griffith was a fucking racist. You know, one of his films was responsible for the reinvigoration of the KKK, for God's sake. And yet we talk about...
Meanwhile, Alice Guy-Blaché directs the very first film with an all African-American cast. Now, that movie has some problems in our current understanding of the world. However... a little bit. Like, it's definitely not... The movie itself is, you know, it's problems, but and the reason she did that was because she had white actors who refused to work with these black actors. And so she's just like, okay. And she could have just had white people in blackface, but she's like, no, fine. I'll just recast these white actors as, you know, with black actors instead. And so she had this film that was all an entirely black cast. And I thought that was pretty interesting. Yeah. And that was like 1909 or something.
Yeah, it is really interesting, and I think that it's that, you know, again, it's important to note those things, and to a lot of people when they talk about D.W. Griffith, and of course, for anyone who doesn't know, the movie that we're talking about here is Birth of a Nation, which is a very influential film, and I think that's always one of the issues that you have to grapple with when you're talking about people like Griffith, is that it is an influential film, you know, even though it is terrible. In terms of what it depicts and its extreme racism, etc., it also influenced a lot of subsequent films. And so that's something that you always have to grapple with in dealing with that. But it is also good to note that people like Alice Guy-Blaché were making movies that even if, you know, some of the things that we look at now and we go like, I'm not 100% comfortable with that, right? And you shouldn't be. Right. But it was a very different view of African Americans. It was a very different view than what we see, obviously, in something like Birth of a Nation. You know, we've talked a little bit. We talked a little bit about this a month ago or so about the early Black filmmakers. People like Oscar Micheaux, who made, Oscar Micheaux made a film called Within Our Gates, which is, in its own way, kind of a response to Birth of a Nation. It's a response to D.W. Griffith. And saying, like, you know, no, this is the reality of lynching in the early part of the 20th century. This is the reality of African-American life. And in some ways it's a polemic, and that's fine. But it's an interesting kind of counterpoint. And the problem is we talk a lot about the influence of Griffith, but we don't talk a lot about the influence of Micheaux or about the complexity of racial relationships and gender relationships in this early period of cinema. We very much focus on, well, this is a terrible film, but it's so important, so we have to talk about it. It's like, well, we do have to talk about it, but I think we should also talk about these other films as well. That this is not... It isn't just black and white. It isn't just, you know, this was just the way that it was. No, this really wasn't the way that it was, you know, and we can see that in the films of the period.
Yeah, and this is something that we have a problem with now, where people will suddenly discover that such and such movie was problematic back in the 80s or the 90s or 2 years ago, you know, and it's like, wait, you really think we weren't talking about that when it came out? Yes, of course we were. And it's the same thing. It's like, yeah, back in the 20s, people had issues with certain things. Like, yeah, when Birth of the Nation came out, that was a controversial movie when it came out. It's not something that everyone just accepted as fine. Like, sure, there were people who thought it was great, but it was a controversial film that people definitely argued about and disagreed with and had thoughts about back then. Even this isn't something that we just recently discovered as problematic.
No, exactly. And you also see this in terms of not just in terms of the conflict between white filmmakers and African American filmmakers, but one of the first films to actually have a completely Chinese American cast was The Curse of Kwang Guan, which was made by Marion E. Wong in I believe 1917. Now, this is a film that only a couple of reels of it survive, and this is actually one of the things I want to talk about in terms of the issues of silent cinema in just a minute. But just to kind of round out this discussion of the issue of race and the way that race was represented, this is a film made by a Chinese-American director starring entirely Chinese-American cast about the Chinese-American experience. Marion E. Wong established a film company in California in the early part of the 20th century. You know, this is really spectacular. And now the film itself, because we have so little of it, there's not a lot that we can kind of extrapolate from it. But it's really fascinating that this actually existed. This was something that was actually produced during a very early period, and it's an incredibly important discovery. It's an incredibly important film, and it's also something that needs to be acknowledged, that the film industry, particularly in the early period, was not just populated by a bunch of straight white men. It was populated by a whole lot of people. People of color, women of color, all kinds of filmmakers who were producing some really fascinating work and good work. That's the thing. This was like, a lot of these films are good. These are not, boring, pointless movies. These are films that are really interesting. They have problems, but they also have some fascinating points. And there's something that should be watched and should be experienced and studied. And also to kind of complicate the narrative that white men invented Hollywood or white men invented film. They didn't. Like, cinema is built on the backs of a lot more than just white guys. And that's very important.
White men didn't invent most of the things that they claim to have invented. So they've actually invented very few things. But that's neither here nor there.
They usually stole it from a woman or a person of color.
Exactly. And that is 100% true. Look it up. Don't get mad at me. But that's the thing. Like, and this comes back to what I was saying to you about YouTube. And like, when you're in the early days of something and everyone's experimenting, there's no limit. There's no you can do this and you can't do that, because everyone's just trying to figure it out. And so in those very earliest days, a big part of the reason Hollywood was even founded in the first place was because of how expensive it was to do stuff back east. And so people started moving out here. They could get land, they could get all kinds of things way cheaper. Electricity was a little bit easier to come by for an affordable price. The taxes were much lower back then. A little different now, but yeah, so people started moving out here just because it was cheaper to do these things. Back then, film was extremely expensive, and so they had to find ways that they could cut costs and things. And so that was kind of where Hollywood was born. And there weren't limitations on who could open a studio and who could star in a movie, because they didn't know yet to put limitations on it. They still didn't think, I think you mentioned this at the beginning, like they still didn't know if this was going to go anywhere. They didn't know that there was going to be this big booming multi-trillion-dollar industry that would eventually be born out of it. Once they figured out that that's where it was headed, then they pushed out all the women and the people of color. But But that's the thing, like, anybody could do anything back then because it was just all experimentation. And it was just kind of this free-for-all. And this is one of the things that, when I was watching both the Frances Marion and Alice Guy docs last night, I just kept thinking, it's insane to me that we're still trying to get just more than 4%. We just want to go more than 4% of women directing studio films. But back in the early days, women were owning studios. They were opening them. They were producing half of the movies and directing half of the movies before they even had the right to vote.
Yeah.
And it's just insane to me that now people act like we're crazy and demanding just because we want, 2 or 3 additional women directing big studio films. It's insane. How did we go backwards?
Well, and it is partially because of the way that the industry developed, the fact that men held the purse strings to a certain degree, that men were the studio heads, and as Hollywood begins to develop as sort of a major cinematic force in the world, men obviously came into a great deal of power. And then there were also very notable successes, and people like D.W. Griffith was a very successful filmmaker. One of the things I think that's important to just mention is that there's an estimate that something like 80% of silent films that were produced in this period are gone. And by that I mean that they do not exist anymore. They were this was a period where, again, and part of this was about the question of how ephemeral film was, and film stock, particularly in this time period, was very flammable, it tended to break down over the years. And a lot of people just really didn't think that this was going to be anything. You were producing very quick features or shorts as a source of entertainment, as a source of fast entertainment, that then, you figured you weren't going to show them again. And so a lot of film stock was stripped, like literally just erased, so that it could be reused. Films were improperly stored. They broke down. We hear all of these stories about film storehouses burning down because the film stock was incredibly flammable, or simply reels literally being stored in people's basements where they succumbed to mildew and broke down. So there is the majority, when you really think about it, the majority of the films that were produced during that period don't exist anymore. And so we only know, some of them we only know about because they were talked about in publications, or we have some information about them from contemporary, like, PR runs and things like that. But there are a whole bunch of films that we just don't know existed. And we will never know existed. And that's one of the tragedies of early cinema, is that there was so little desire to preserve, there was so little attempt to preserve, and some of them simply couldn't have been preserved with the technology that existed at that point. So, you think about the number of films and reels and some of these films that we're talking about, there are only fragments that remain, that are just gone, and we will never get to see them. And it's sad, but it also kind of reminds us that this is the beginning of an art form, and we always need to think about the fact that what we're seeing is a very small snippet of what people were actually making in that period.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's so much stuff that we'll never get to know or see or whatever, but it's just all the more reason why we need to preserve what we have. And even that is being lost. And so it's like, sure, it's great they've been able to restore a whole lot of Alice Guy films, but there are estimates that there are hundreds more that have disappeared that she produced and directed. And it's sad that's happened, but there's nothing we can do about it. But we can preserve these early films and stop letting them just disappear. And this is one of the things that's so frustrating about what, the big studios are doing now with Warner and Disney, and where they're just releasing the stuff that they think they can make money on. And it's like, put what you have into the public domain. Let us have access to it. Preserve this history.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think that it's important that we're aware of this. It's important that I think anyone as film critics, but also just as viewers, are aware that we have a particular view, a particular pop cultural view, I guess, of early cinema. That it's boring, or that nothing interesting was being done, that it's just kind of like, it's just old people in old-timey costumes and things like that. And of course that isn't true even when you talk about the films that we do still have. But also there's this impression, we've talked about this a lot on this podcast, there's this impression that it was always just patriarchal domination. It was always white male domination. And that does a disservice, I think, to the history of cinema, and it does a disservice to the efforts of the people from that period to begin with. It does a disservice to people like Oscar Micheaux, to just, because these are, quote, old films, to just ignore them and to ignore their existence. And you see it a lot with film critics. So, we talk about people who are like, oh, everybody loves things like Metropolis, which is an early German expressionist film by Fritz Lang. And we're going to talk about Metropolis. Isn't this fascinating about Metropolis? Just like, okay, well, yes, Metropolis is a very important film, and it's a very good film. But you also have to talk about some of Lang's other films, and the other filmmakers who were making films around the same period. That it wasn't just this, monolithic canonical production of these are the important movies and everything else should be ignored. A lot of the things that are being ignored are the films that are made by marginalized people and by people that were actually trying to tell their stories in, 1915, long before, long before Ava DuVernay was born. And that this is a complicated narrative, that it's far more than just, these very important movies made by very white men.
And I don't even know what else to say. Watch old movies. Watch the oldest movies that you can. What's the oldest movie you've seen, Lauren?
I'm actually trying to think. It's got to be pretty early, probably it's got to be at least 1895.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen those very earliest ones, so I think that horse racing, like running horse thing, is the very first that they have. I don't know if it's the very first one made, but it's the first one that they have still preserved. That's the one I remember watching in 6th grade.
I remember that one. Yeah, I mean, I think
that's from like 1870 or something.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, we tend to today, as we were saying at the beginning of all this, we tend to date cinema from the first exhibition of the Lumiere brothers films, which was 1895. But there were pre-cinema things being done prior to that, and so there's this whole argument. And then again, you always have this difficulty because a lot of these films don't exist anymore. There's only kind of reports of them. And then others others are difficult to date. It's like, well, was this made in like 1888? Was this made in 1870? It's definitely the latter part of the 19th century, but how far towards the 20th century it was going is sort of an open question.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I think that we should talk about, moving ahead just a little bit, we've talked a lot about early cinema. One of the things I think we should talk about is, so you get kind of the buildup of Hollywood. You also get the buildup of a lot of other film industries across the world. There is a burgeoning Japanese film industry. There's a Russian film industry. His most famous director was Eisenstein, who did Battleship Potemkin, and kind of didn't create, but sort of popularized the concept of Soviet montage and the use of montage images, which essentially, if you watch any of Eisenstein's films, he likes cutting together images that might not necessarily have a diegetic relationship with each other. So, one of his more famous shots is this shot of this Russian general who is sort of the villain of the piece, and the camera literally cuts to an image of a peacock. I think it's a mechanical peacock. In fact, I would have to look it up again. It's like the image of a peacock, and then back to this Russian general. And of course, the comparison that is being made here is a very explicit comparison between this general and a peacock. But the peacock is not in the same scene with the general. It is it's a montage image that he's using as a point of comparison. And so Eisenstein kind of is a major innovator in that sort of filmmaking, and it's almost, some of his films almost have a nearly surreal aspect to them because of that, because you're like, well, where the fuck did the peacock come from? But it has it isn't surreal in the sense that it's not dream logic. It has a very logical relationship. Like, you understand what he is trying to do. He's trying to draw this comparison. In Germany, of course, you got the developing German film industry and kind of the creation of Weimar cinema, which is prior to the rise of Nazism in Germany, obviously. But also one of the main features of this is the rise of German expressionism, which has a huge influence eventually on world filmmaking, on German filmmaking, and on Hollywood filmmaking, when a number of the early sort of progenitors of German expressionism leave Germany and go to France, and then eventually to Hollywood. People like Fritz Lang, some of the other early filmmakers are people like F.W. Murnau and Robert Vine, who are producing some really, again, fantastic images. We've talked before about the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And, we mentioned Lang's Metropolis, Murnau's Nosferatu, who are, like, these very, very early examples of horror cinema and the use of chiaroscuro, so the contrast between light and dark, the use of canted angles and much more complicated cinematography. And not only are these great films, again, if you're talking about influential, these are very influential films. Horror cinema as we know it does not exist without it.
Right.
So, I know people are like, oh, old movies. No, you gotta go back and watch Caligari. You have to go back and watch Nosferatu, and funny thing is, you actually see images that you're going to recognize because they have been used throughout the years, including in What We Do in the Shadows, as I was rewatching some episodes yesterday. The whole, we're going to rise out of the coffin, straight up. That's straight out of Nosferatu.
When I was watching Nosferatu, it really reminded me of What We Do in the Shadows. And
yeah. But so then, meanwhile, in Hollywood, you obviously have the birth of Hollywood and kind of the creation of what would eventually become the studio system, and the rise of various comedians, performers, etc. I know that you wanted to talk a little bit about Frances Marion, who is being featured on the Criterion Channel this week.
She is. I was so happy. The timing was so perfect. I saw that and I was just like, oh my gosh, awesome. There's, I think, 13 films that she wrote that they've included. But one of the things they have on there is this, it's about an hour-long documentary that I think was actually done for TCM. It plays out like it was originally on TV. And it's about her career. And she started off, she was living in San Francisco in 1906. The earthquake and the Great San Francisco Fire happened. And so she ended up moving down to Hollywood. And she was really pretty, so they wanted to get her into modeling. And she was just like, all right, but that's not really what I want to do. And so she ended up kind of getting into writing. And one of the things that I learned is that she was so she was the first woman to win an Academy Award for screenwriting. And she was the first person to win a second Academy Award. I didn't know that. So she got one other Oscar nomination after that too. But she was at one point, just like you were talking about Lois Weber being the highest paid director, Frances Marion was the highest paid writer. And part of that was because she became really good friends with Mary Pickford, who was the big, everywhere. everyone knew Mary Pickford, and so the two of them teamed up, and it got to where Pickford would tell studios, like, I'm not going to do your movie unless Frances writes it. And they became an unstoppable pair. And it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, this is why women have to champion each other. This is why we have to support each other, because the men are out to get us a lot of times, even if they don't think they are. They are. And when we band together and we help each other out, we all win. And I just thought that was such an inspiring thing to learn about their friendship and how that really worked. And it was, yeah, I mean, she wrote things like The Champ, and which is I love that movie. And her first Oscar was for a movie called The Big House, which was the first film that really put you inside the prison system and experiencing being in prison and what that feels like, just getting there, like being processed and then being, going through that whole thing. And this was written by a woman. She wasn't a prisoner. She'd never been to prison, but her story it really resonated with people, and it was just such a great film. And she just had so many of those where it was just, she just had this way of tapping into the whole range of emotions. And like one of the first films that she and Pickford worked on together, Poor Little Rich Girl, I think it was.
That sounds right.
The studio didn't want to put it out. They said, no, this is terrible. This is a disaster. This is an embarrassment. We don't want to do it. And they kind of ended up having their hands forced because there was I should have written it down, but there was some kind of problem. And basically the theaters were like, you have to give us something. And that was the only thing they had that they could release. And so Mary Pickford and Frances Marion dress up in disguises and go to the theater because they wanted to hear what the audience thought after being told by the studio that it was trash. And the audience loved it. They ate it up. They were laughing at all the right places. They just had a ball. And that was really what launched the two of them together. And it was like, yeah, in your face, studio executives, you don't always know what people want.
Well, I mean, that's a major film for Pickford. Like, that's one of her big ones, Yeah,
I mean, exactly, yeah.
And it
almost never saw the light of day.
That's the thing. That's something we should remark on. Stardom in this period. Mary Pickford wielded a lot of power. I mean, she helped to form United Artists with Douglas Fairbanks and Charlie Chaplin. So she wielded a lot of power. So did Douglas Fairbanks. So did Charlie Chaplin. So did people like Raymond Navarro and famously Rudolph Valentino. I actually recently watched Anna Christie, which is this is getting into the talking period, but which is the first time that Greta Garbo spoke on screen. And was scripted. It's based on a play by Eugene O'Neill, but it was scripted by Frances Marion. And it's a very interesting film. It's a little stagey. It's one of those early talkies that it's quite obvious that they're not quite certain what to do with the camera, and they're not quite certain how to place the microphone in order to pick up everything. Like my roommate and I were actually laughing about Singing in the Rain and the whole with Gene Hagen. At one point they put the microphone in a bush in order to try to pick up the voices, and Gene Hagen is like, well, I can't make love to a bush.
I love that part.
And
I love that movie. It's so good.
You know what? I just as a sidebar, Gene Hagen is an incredibly underrated actress. She is funny in that, and it's like some of the biggest laughs in the movie. I know she's like the titular, she's sort of the villain, I guess, but some of the biggest laughs in that movie actually come from her.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
So
she's great. Yeah,
she deserves respect. But so you've got these huge stars, that had a lot of power.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things that I found was interesting, was because Mary Pickford, she's the big you know, big movie star. Everybody loves her. She's beautiful. She's funny. The way that she, like, Frances Marion meets her, she walks into an editing bay one day, and there's Mary Pickford cutting her own film. Like, she was editing, she was cutting the negatives, and that was how they met. And it's just like, see, even the stars, like, nothing was, you know, for some of them, nothing was beneath them. They helped out with their own productions in the earliest days because they found it interesting. They wanted to know how to do it. They, you know, sometimes it was just there was no one else around available. So I just thought that was really interesting. There was, like, for Mary Pickford, it wasn't beneath her to be cutting negatives. Mm-hmm. You know, and it's just fascinating. And something else, too, you mentioned that Mary Pickford founded United Artists. Well, Frances Marion helped start the WGA. And part of the reason that happened was because in the 30s, and yeah, this is getting a little bit past where we wanted to start, but, or where we wanted to leave off for today, but, in the 30s, during the Depression, they were cutting salaries, they were not paying people because, you know, nobody had any money, and at that time, Frances Marion was making $3,000 a week, or something like that, maybe it was a month. But she was making a ton of money. And so for her to get her salary cut in half was no big deal because there were a lot of people that were barely making $50 a week. But she was just like, no, this is wrong. And so she helped start the WGA and was the first vice president because she wanted to support other artists. She wanted to support her fellow writers. And she knew that she was very privileged and that she had this great position. And she didn't use that just to further herself. She used that to help other people.
Because women are inherently superior.
Exactly. We take care of one another.
Speaking of which, so we've talked a lot about female directors, but we did have a question actually about female directors. This is from B. Peterson at Blue Gray Closet. I recently heard on Critic Acclaim's Letters podcast that during the silent era, female directors were much more common. Are there any big-name female Hollywood directors that have filmographies worth diving into? I mean, yes, obviously. We've talked about some of them recently. Definitely Lois Weber. Who is definitely a Hollywood director, and that she worked for Universal, etc. Alice Guy-Blaché as some of the earlier female directors, and nicely, a lot of their films are available. They are available on YouTube. They're also available. Kino has done a great job in restoring some of these films and in making fragments available, in making various feature-length films available. So it's definitely worth it. I think one of the things you do have to be aware of before going into some of these is that there are definitely dated things that are in a lot of these films. Lois Weber made a very odd film, I believe called Where Are My Children, which deals directly with the issue of abortion and contraception, and is a very interesting film in terms of that, but also definitely has some problematic elements to it, including a kind of a support of eugenics, which is a little troubling, but is very much in keeping with the time period that she was working in. But her films are fascinating, and I think worth watching, not just because they're good films, they're well-made films, but also because they give you more of an insight into some topics of the period that a lot of male directors didn't want to deal with, but that a female director actually did. The other one is Mabel Normand, who was a partner with Charlie Chaplin and with Fatty Arbuckle, and made some of her own films. She's a fantastic female comedian. Did you have other people that you wanted to talk about, Karen?
Other than the ones that we've already mentioned, I would also just add Lotte Reiniger.
Yes.
With just some amazing early animation. The Adventures of Prince Ahmed is just phenomenal. She did all kinds of fairy tales. She did Sleeping Beauty. What else did she do? I think she did a Hansel and Gretel. Yeah, just some really fascinating innovations in animation. So definitely she's one that I would add.
Yes, definitely. But also just, look around. Like I say, I think that's something like, and we're not sponsored by Kino, but they have actually, they've made available in very high quality prints a lot of films that were made by women that just haven't been available. You can watch the remaining fragments of The Curse of Kwang Gon and Marion E. Wong's film, and documentary films by Zora Neale Hurston. And it's important to actually, take a step and watch some of these films, because there's some really interesting stuff that was being done by female directors that has kind of gotten pushed to the side, and it's really wonderful that we do have these things available now. The other question that we had that I didn't really mention in the early part of this discussion, from David Blake Fagiani, not really a question, but please mention electrocuting an elephant. Really stuck with me upon reading and seeing at uni. Electrocuting an Elephant is the Thomas Edison film, in which an elephant gets electrocuted on screen.
And of course it was Thomas Edison.
Of course it was Thomas Edison. And if you haven't seen it, it is available. You can watch this actually happen. It is horrifying. And Bob's Burgers did a fantastic episode covering this incident called Topsy. And so I also recommend the Bob's Burgers episode, which basically says all of the things that we should really feel about Thomas Edison. He was very influential and, an important figure in history. He was also a terrible human being. So there, we've mentioned electrocuting an elephant, an example of maybe what we should not be doing in filmmaking.
And why women should direct all the films.
Yeah, because we did not film electrocuting an elephant. Like, we're just like, we're going to watch an animal die now.
Yeah.
Good times.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David, for that. And then, of course, and Nanina from Nanina Gilder did ask about what the hell is going on in that GIF, the GIF that I posted of the pig dancing, and that is the dancing pig, and that is available on YouTube.
Le cochon danseur.
And it will haunt you for the rest of your days. I have to say, early films are fucking weird. There's just some weird shit that goes down in those films, and then you watch it, and you're like, what is even happening? There's a version of Goldilocks that I saw in grad school that is just haunting and terrifying, and you're just like, oh, this is like a version of Goldilocks, and then it gets fucked up really fast, and I'm not going to spoil it, but everyone go and watch it. I think it's actually called The Teddy Bears. It's a
yes.
I think it's an Edwin S. Porter film, but it is bizarre. And like, seriously, just like, oh, it's just a Goldilocks movie. This is kind of weird. And they're like, oh my god, why?
If you think people in 1902 were Puritans, you don't know what you're talking about.
This shit gets weird.
They were messed up.
So I think a good way to close this out would be to talk about, what do we consider some of the essentials of silent filmmaking? Not just the big ones, like Metropolis or The General, although those are very important films. If you have not seen them, please, see them. They are worth it, and they're very good movies. But what are some others that maybe are lesser known that we consider to be essential silent cinema? So I'll go first. I do think that stuff like Metropolis and The General are really necessary. Go and watch some of the early Buster Keaton shorts. So stuff like Sherlock Jr., which is one of his feature films.
I love Sherlock Jr. I'm so glad you mentioned that one. That's one of my favorites.
Sherlock Jr. is a great example of what early cinema, silent cinema, can accomplish, because the photography in that is just great. It's really cool, and it's an interaction between the character and film, really. But even just some of his early shorts, a lot of which are available on YouTube or on Internet Archive. A lot of these films that we're talking about, by the way, are in the public domain, so you can see them pretty much anywhere. So some of his early shorts, the shorts that he did with Fatty Arbuckle, are very funny. They're very different. They, again, have to take with a grain of salt in terms of racial sensitivity sometimes. There are moments where you're like, oh, please don't do that. But, you know, we gotta take the bad with the good sometimes. Also, of course, Charlie Chaplin's early films. Chaplin, again, one of those big filmmakers, one of the original auteurs, really. And I would also say things like the original Ben-Hur, which starred Raymond Navarro, and again is a very interesting film. And I actually think is a better film than the later one from the 50s that starred Charlton Heston. Like the chariot race in the original Ben-Hur, I think, is more terrifying than the chariot race in the 1950s one, partially because like people are actually dying. Famously, there's a famous ship burning sequence in the original Ben-Hur in which like numerous extras died, like they drowned, and they literally lit ships on fire. Like they're like, oh, we're gonna start a fire and see if you can get out. I mean, that was kind of what was going on. That's the other thing about a lot of these films is that a lot of them, these are actual people doing these actual stunts because there is no protection. There are no union rules. There is no like, let's protect the extras. No, the extras might die. And it's this, I'm not saying that this is a good thing. It is an interesting thing, and it definitely makes the films feel very immediate, and it certainly throws the sort of acrobatics of people like Keaton and Chaplin into relief, where you're like, holy shit, they actually did that. And they didn't die. Wow.
Yeah. Sorry. I was a little bit distracted by something happening outside my window. But, yeah, it's really amazing to see the things that happened in early film, and it's a good thing that we're protecting people now. But
yes, it is.
But they got some really great footage out of it. Just kidding. But no, some other ones I think for myself. You mentioned Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin. I love them. I really love the earliest Mickey Mouse cartoons, like Steamboat Willie. Yeah. I love that. And some of those are great. I really like Wings, which was the first film to ever win Best Picture. And it's this big war movie, and it's kind of that where you see film in transition in the like 1925 to 1928, where you're really starting to see how big they could go and what they could accomplish. And I think Wings is a great example of that. And there's some other ones, like you mentioned, Metropolis, and just where you really start to see the direction and how the industry is starting to take shape, and before the men kicked out the women and bastardized it. But no, I say that sort of kidding. I mean, there's some really great men that made movies. We've talked about a few today, but yeah, I mean, some of those early films are just really, really incredible. And even if you don't like them, you should still watch them and experience them and understand this. I mean, we've talked about this a million times on this podcast, but it's like, if you're a big fan of Steven Spielberg, that's great. Go and watch the films that inspired Steven Spielberg. You'll understand his films now and appreciate them on a whole other level when you understand what he grew up with and what made him want to get into filmmaking and what the references are that he's using in his films. If you like Alfred Hitchcock, he was inspired by people. He didn't just drop out of the sky and start making films. I mean, he even referenced people like Alice Guy as inspirational and influential on his work. So yeah, watch these films by these earliest directors to really get the full experience of the films that you like.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Hitchcock actually worked for Murnau. He was a title card writer for Murnau, and he did a whole bunch of different things. But so You know, if you want to see some of the influences in Hitchcock's work and where he came from. And also, you know, I have to say, these films are entertaining. These are not bad films.
They are.
A lot of these, yes, there are some boring ones, just like there are some boring ones right now. Yes, sometimes you have to kind of recalibrate your brain in order to kind of get what they're doing. There is a style of acting, there is a style of filmmaking that is being used that is, you know, might be a little odd to initially, but these are great films, and some of them are just really fascinating and do fascinating
and no
things.
You can't you can't play with your phone while you're watching a silent movie. Which I know is frustrating for people.
That's
you have
true.
to actually watch what's happening on the screen.
That's true, yeah.
But do it, it's worth it.
That's true. I also wanted to suggest a really great film. This is a Swedish fantasy film, The Phantom Carriage, which is a little bit later, from 1921, and is directed by, I can never pronounce his name correctly, Victor Sjöström, who also did The Wind in 1928, which is famous, starring Lillian Gish, which is also available, by the way, on Criterion Channel. But the Phantom Carriage is a great horror/fantasy movie. And again, you know, you see all of these influences and where contemporary filmmaking comes from, you know, if that's the only reason why you're watching these films, great. But as I say, these are actually entertaining films, so spend a little bit of time with them.
Yeah, I have not seen The Phantom Carriage, but I found that it was on Criterion last night when I was scrolling through stuff, so I added it to my list. I was like, oh, I gotta watch this, because I've been wanting to see that one for a while.
It's a really, really interesting movie. So I think that basically what we want to come away with all this is saying there's a lot of stuff that we haven't talked about. I mean, I haven't mentioned Lon Chaney Sr. We haven't really talked about Greta Garbo. We haven't talked about a lot of the big stars, or even a lot of the big directors. But, you know, early cinema and silent cinema has a lot to offer, and it has a lot to offer beyond what we consider the classics, and particularly because the classics tend to be the films that are made by white men. And there's a lot of stuff that was made that was not made by white men, and that have a very different perspective and a very important perspective. And these can be fascinating films, funny films, exciting films, offensive films, films that you find boring, films that you find entertaining, but they are very important films, and they're worth experiencing for anyone who likes movies, period. Whether you're a critic, whether you're just a casual film goer, there's a lot that's available. And also, you should be in quarantine, so what else are you going to do?
Yeah. Well, and I think you bring up an excellent point. I'm so tired of people talking about how they love movies, but they refuse to watch certain ones. Like, there are certain genres I don't enjoy, but guess what? If someone says, hey, you should watch this movie, I'm going to try it out. Like, I don't necessarily love, as a genre, I don't love martial arts films, but there are certain ones that I'm like, wow, that's a really great movie, and I'll try anything because I love film. And I can't stand when people, I think a lot of people, when they say they love film, they mean that they love modern films, and they just don't give it a try. It's like, just try new things. If you really like this, if you care about this and you're really passionate about this medium, and you really want, and especially if you want to write about it, you need to understand, like I said, you need to understand the things that influence the people that you love and the movies that you love.
Mm-hmm. I think that this is going to be a refrain for the next couple of weeks. Just watch these movies!
Well, exactly. Well, and that's the thing. I think that for anybody listening, this is something that we're going to be doing over the next, who knows how long. We're just going to kind of go through eras. We're going to talk about different directors and stars and stuff. So if there are certain topics you'd like us to cover, let us know, because we'd love to do a deeper dive into certain things that are interesting to you. And maybe it'll be stuff that's new for both of us, or at least definitely for me. Lauren's watched a lot more movies than I have, but yeah, if there's certain things you want us to cover, let us know and we'll see what we can do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm certain that we're going to come back to some of these questions and problems later, and stars and directors, as you say, later on. Just a reminder, this is a good segue to the end of our program. Just a reminder that many of the films that we are talking about right now are indeed available on the Criterion Channel, and we are running a contest to win 3 months of the Criterion Channel.
We are?
We are,
that's
yes,
cool.
That's right. And I have no idea why you wouldn't want to do this, because we're literally going to pay for you to have 3 months of the Criterion Channel.
There is no obligation on your part.
So in order to enter, the only thing you have to do is enter. So in order to enter, please send us an email, comment, or DM with your most surprising blind spot. Subject line, if you're sending an email, is Criterion, and you can send that to citizendamepod@gmail.com. And just tell us what your most surprising cinematic blind spot is. So if you've never seen The Godfather, most surprising is The Godfather. It can be something that you feel is surprising, but that we'll be like, man, I've never seen that movie. I don't know what you're talking about. That's not surprising at all. It can honestly be anything. We all have them. This is not about shaming or anything like that. I think all of us have.
Yeah, we are not judging you.
Yeah, all of us have films that we have not seen and that we feel like we should have. So email us, comment or DM with your most surprising blind spot, and you will be entered to win 3 months of the Criterion Channel on us, and we will announce the winner at some point over the next couple of weeks. So keep that in mind. Of course, as always, you can get in touch with us on Twitter and Instagram at CitizenDamePod. We are also on Facebook, facebook.com/CitizenDame. You can email us at citizendamepod@gmail.com. Our website is citizendamepod.com, where we have reviews. There will actually be some reviews of some new Alice Guy-Blaché discs coming up, so I'm excited about that.
Yay!
If you want to kick us some money, we always appreciate it, and we are trying to do more things for our patrons, and we're just really appreciative of the people who are patronizing us at this period, because of course we know how difficult things are right now and weird things are. Our Patreon is patreon.com/citizendame, and we want to thank our current patrons: Heather, Adriana, Crooked Table Podcast, Michael, James, Katie, Carriata, Mason, Matthew, Monty, Nanina, Nicole, Robert, Sharon, Steve, Tao, and Will. Thank you guys so much, and for continuing to kind of support us and supporting the podcast, and also makes us feel loved. If you want to buy some stuff, we do have a Zazzle store. That's zazzle.com/citizendame, and you can also kick us some dollars at our Ko-Fi account. That's ko-fi.com/citizendame. Karen, what are you up to this week?
This week I'm gonna watch some more movies and do some more work. I don't know, what am I watching this week? Oh, Snowpiercer is starting. I'm so excited. It's finally the TNT show based on the Bong Joon-ho film, which is based on a graphic novel, and it stars Daveed Diggs, and I'm already in love with it.
Yes. Yeah. I think actually after this entire conversation, I'm like, I want to watch some silent movies. So I'm going to go and find some silent movies that I have not seen and watch them and see if I can find something new that I love. So I think that is going to close this out. We're going to come back next week, and we'll be talking more about film history and theory and directors and important people that you may have heard of or you may not have, and we'll be shaming you into watching a whole bunch of new movies. So I am always contactable at LH Business on Twitter and Instagram. Karen, where are you?
I am at Karen M. Peterson.
And that will close this out. We will talk to you guys later.
Bye.
Cut! Lena, we're missing every other word. You've got to talk into the mic.
Well, I can't make love to a bush.
All right. We'll have to think of something.